All right, thanks everybody. Very good to have you here. This delay is a lot worse than I expected, I have to say. Anyways, all right, so I'm very excited to present our next speaker, Professor Frances Egan, who's better known as Frankie to her friends. She completed her PhD actually just down the road in Western University, did an undergrad at the University of Manitoba, so a homegrown Canadian, who then went to Rutgers University and has been there for the remainder of her career. And I think there's something kind of great about having a famous philosopher of mind with the name Frankie, because to me, that sounds like the mafia is involved in philosophy of mind, which makes it sound like a lot cooler. And I don't know if you've gone to her homepage, but there's a picture of her sitting there, kind of leaning back, dark shades, underneath the palm tree, looking a little bit intimidating. And so I always just imagine that, you know, if you're going to run into somebody one day who's going to say, so your computational model, you got representations in your computational model, you think they got meaning? Well, we're going to send Frankie over, she'll set you straight. Right? All right, so, all right, let me continue with my introduction. Of course, I was just digressing. So she's, as I mentioned, a professor at the Rutgers University, and her work focuses on cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and perception. She's done a lot of very highly respected work on the relationship between folk and scientific representations, particularly in psychological explanation. Recently, she's done some very well-known work on computational modeling, which I follow, and obviously makes some interesting claims, not all of which I would agree with, but I find it, you know, very worthwhile to engage with about the nature of representations and meanings and so on inside computational models. Recently, last year, she was awarded the very prestigious Jean Nicode Prize, and so she gave the Jean Nicode lectures, 4 of them, which are then subsequently published. And that puts her in very heady company. Other winners include John Searle, Liz Spelke, Dan Dennett, and Jerry Fodor. So very well-deserved recognition of her impact on the field of philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Professor Egan agreed over 2 years ago, about 2.5 years ago, to come and talk at Waterloo Brain Day. And of course, the pandemic has made us wait, but I'm sure it's well worth it. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Egan to be talking about representations in neural models.
Okay, so talk of representation is widespread in computational neuroscience and computational psychology. Theorists talk about, vision theorists, for example, talk about structures that they posit in their models representing edges in the scene. There's lots of talk of in various kinds of neuroscientific models of structures representing their neurons, for example, or groups of neurons representing elements of their receptive fields. So lots of talk of representations, but there's surprisingly little consensus on how to understand this talk. So one possibility is that it might be, maybe it should be taken absolutely literally. Representational talk is really committed to representations in some very strong sense. But another possibility is that it's really just a useful fiction. So that's the issue that I want to address today. So the aims of the talk are first to unpack the role that representation plays in the sciences that aim to explain our cognitive capacities, in particular computational cognitive psychology and computational neuroscience, and then to argue that neither a realist nor a fictionalist interpretation of representational talk is appropriate. And I call the right interpretation deflationary. Now, don't worry about what, I'll explain what that means, so don't worry about that for the moment. So I want to start by getting a fix on the notion of representation. So let me talk a little bit about some central examples that you'll recognize. Utterances, written text, maps, photographs, drawings, graphs, pie charts, and so on. Now, these are all public representations. We can see them, we can discuss them, we can work with them, and so on. One important feature of all of these examples is that there's a distinction to be drawn between the vehicle of representation, which is something physical, something that has causal powers. It has causes and effects. So in these examples, for utterances, it's the sound. For written text, it's marks on the page and so on. So on the one hand, there's the vehicle, which is a physical thing. And on the other hand is content or meaning or the information conveyed or the message. Now the content or meaning, it's not free floating. It's carried by the vehicle. It's attached to the vehicle in some way. And a further important property of all of these representations is that having content entails correctness conditions. So if something's a representation, then hopefully it normally accurately represents what it's about, but it's also possible to misrepresent, to get it wrong, to say something misleading or just flat out wrong. So for example, a photograph of Jack and Jill might misrepresent Jack as being taller than Jill if he's standing on a box. Or if the labels Waterloo and New York are switched on a map, then the map will misrepresent New York as being north of Waterloo. So for all of these examples, they're capable of misrepresenting. So if there really are mental representations or internal representations, then they should have roughly the properties that these central examples have. So, let me say a little bit more about that because it's really going to be important in my argument. So if so-called mental representations or neural representations don't have these properties, then it's a stretch to call them representations. Then it really would be kind of a metaphorical or a fictional extension. So if we're going to evaluate whether when neuroscientists use representational talk, they're really committing to representations, then we've got to have our hands on the notion, on what notion we're interested in. What would it be to be a representation? So again, vehicle content distinction and correctness conditions. And so that leads to the possibility that those might not be satisfied in a given case. And so any putative representation is capable of misrepresenting the way things are. Okay, so the question I'm interested in is computational neuroscientists use representational talk, but should such talk be taken literally? Do computational models really posit internal representations? And here are two possible answers. One is what we might call robust realism, which is the idea that representational talk is to be taken literally. Mental representations are as real as written text, maps, and so on, all the public examples that I talked about. Now, another possible answer is fictionalism, according to which representational talk is just a useful fiction. Okay, so I'm going to argue that both of these accounts are wrong. Either one's got it right, but I think there's an element of truth in each. And I'll point out what I think that element of truth is. So I want to defend what a third possibility, what I call deflationism, which I'll say more about. By the end, it'll be hopefully well before the end, it'll be clear what that label means. But the idea is that mental representations are real states or structures of brains or of cognitive systems, and they're given a representational gloss. So basically the idea is that the vehicles are real. So robust realism basically has it right about vehicles. The physically realized things that have causal powers, those are real, but it's wrong about content. And fictionalism, on the other hand, is wrong about vehicles because vehicles are real structures with causal powers. They're not fictions, but fictionalism is sort of on the right track about content. So it's at least better than the account of content given by robust realism. So I'm going to argue for this third possibility. Okay, so one motivation traditionally for fictionalism is the idea that computational descriptions, when they're applied to brains in particular, maybe to cognitive systems in general, but certainly to brains, that they're just metaphors, that brains or minds they're not really computing. So I should have said, I'm turning now from representation, we've got to fix on what the topic is, and I'm now turning to computational models, and then the question is going to be, are these models committed to representations? So one motivation for being a fictionalist about representations in computational models is that the idea that they're just metaphors if they're applied to brains. So here's Louise Barrett in her book Beyond the Brain, How Body and Environment Shape Animal and Human Minds. She thinks that brains aren't really computers, just metaphorical talk, to call them that. And she says, indeed, some people go so far as to argue that the human brain is not just analogous to a computer in a strictly metaphorical sense, but that it actually is a computer in the sense that it takes in input, processes it in various ways, and then produces a specific output. Our use of the computer metaphor is so familiar and comfortable that we sometimes forget that we are dealing only with a metaphor and that there may be other equally interesting and perhaps more appropriate ways to think about brains and nervous systems and what they do. So according to Barrett, then, I mean, there may be other interesting ways of thinking about the brain. That's surely true. But she thinks that the computer model applied to brains is purely metaphorical. Brains don't really compute. Bennett and Hacker, who've written a book called The Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience, agree. So big book, hundreds and hundreds of pages. Bottom line is that brains aren't really computers. Okay, so I think all of these people are wrong. A computational description might be a metaphor. I mean, it can be used in all kinds of ways. So it might be a metaphor. Maybe it's not to be taken as a literal description of the brain. A realist or literal interpretation of computational models not always appropriate. Sometimes it might be serving a fictional or metaphorical purpose. For example, some Bayesian theorists claim that their models are intended merely to systematize and predict behavior, not to describe how the brain actually works. So my colleague in the Rutgers psychology department, Jacob Feldman, who works on vision, this is his view. He thinks he's a Bayesian, he's producing interesting Bayesian models, but he doesn't think he's literally describing what the visual system is doing. But I push back to him and I say that if the purpose is to explain a cognitive capacity with the emphasis on explain, then a metaphor won't do. Metaphors don't explain. So generally then I'm arguing that the metaphor view is mistaken as an account of computational models. Now, a computational model that characterizes a neural system, say as computing integration or vector subtraction, I'll talk a little bit more about these examples, that purports to literally describe neural processes. The brain computes the specified function in the same sense as a hand calculator or an iPad does. Now, of course, computational characterization typically involves idealization, but a computational description of a neural system involves no more idealization than does a computational description of any other physical system. So for example, hand calculators, their capacity to compute is restricted by how big the display is. Physical systems, brains, and so on are subject to memory and other limitations. So we're assuming that there's idealization involved, for example, in saying that a physical system computes the addition function. Well, maybe up to a certain point. So putting the question of idealization aside, still what I'm pushing is that the computational description is a literal description if it's aiming to explain, and that's an important caveat. So despite the idealization, the computational characterization is intended to be literally true of both the brain and the calculator. The explanatory credentials of these models depend on this. If it's just a metaphor, then there's no explanation. Now, a couple of caveats. One is that at an early stage of theorizing, the model may just be a hypothesis without much empirical confirmation. We might not know, for example, how it's realized in the brain. It may be at the early stage just the merest of what's sometimes referred to as a mechanism sketch. It's just a sketch. However, if it's a hypothesis about what the brain's actually doing, then a literal interpretation, it is a hypothesis. A mechanism sketch is typically, the details aren't filled in, but it's a hypothesis at an early stage of theorizing about what the brain is actually doing. Of course, it might turn out to be wrong in all kinds of ways at the early stage, but it's still a hypothesis about what's actually going on. So another caveat, there's always a question about how much of an empirical theory should be interpreted realistically, and how much should be construed simply as a feature of the representational scheme used to articulate the theory. My point is that computational models aim to characterize how neural systems actually compute, though some of the details at a given point in inquiry will not yet be specified. Okay, so the question then is, what is it for a physical system to compute a function? What does that involve? And I want to spell this out. I want to try to answer this question by reference to a simple example of a physical system that computes addition, that adds. So here's kind of a sketch of some physical system that computes the addition function. Most generally, a physical system computes addition just in case there's a mapping from physical states of the system. So down here, P's at the bottom are physical states, neural states if it's a brain, a mapping from physical states of the system to numbers, to addends and sums. Such that when the system's in physical state P1 and P2, that's interpreted as, that's mapped to numbers, and it's caused to, this arrow here is a causal arrow. It's caused to go into some third physical state that's mapped to the sum of the addends, the sum of n and m. So as I've said, this bottom horizontal arrow at the bottom, that's causal. The dotted arrow at the top is just the arrow taking us from the arguments of the function to its values, in this case addition. And I'll say something about the vertical arrows in a minute, but right now I'm just saying this is a mapping from physical states to numbers. And if the system adds, then there will be such a mapping. So running through an example very quickly, if physical state P1 gets mapped to 2 and physical state P2 gets mapped to 3, then the system is caused to go into a third physical state that, under the interpretation here provided by this mapping, is mapped to the number 5. Okay, so on this account, then, this is a standard account of what it is for a physical system to compute some function. It's not original to me. Computational descriptions importantly are abstract, but they're not or needn't be fictions. A computational description is an abstract characterization of the causal organization underlying a cognitive capacity, in this case, the capacity of a system to add. So let me unpack that idea a little bit. What is it to be an abstract characterization of the causal capacity? Computational models characterize the causal organization of the system by specifying the function, again, in the mathematical sense, a function from addends to sums in our example, that the system computes, and then in a fully articulated computational model of a human cognitive capacity, specifying the neural states that realize the arguments and values of the function. So if it's a complete a fully articulated account of an adder, then those physical states, if it's a brain, the neural states that are mapped to numbers will have to be specified. And that obviously takes a whole lot of empirical work. Okay, so unpacking this more, back to our diagram. Here, the mapping from physical states to addends and sums of the function, that picks out in a compact and perspicuous way what the causal organization, how these physical states at the bottom have to be organized in order for the system to have the capacity to add. So what this mapping is doing, there's lots of physical states in any given system. Any given physical system does lots of things. Nothing is just an adder. One thing that lots of physical systems do is they maintain a certain temperature. That's going to be a different sort of causal organization underlying that capacity. So what this mapping does is it picks out in a compact and very, very elegant way, not as a list, but by saying that, look, there's a structure here that we can map to, that's mapped to the addition function in this really nice, elegant way that allows us to predict what the system's going to do. So what this mapping does then, of all of the causal, there's lots of causal organization in any physical system, it picks out just that causal organization that underlies or that's responsible for the system's capacity to add. And so that's what a computational model of a cognitive capacity does, most generally. Okay, so question, is there representation here? Is there representation here? Well, we could see these physical states at the bottom as representing the numbers to which they're mapped. So we see P1 and P2 in my example. P1, we could see it as representing 2, P2 as representing 3, P3 as representing 5. We could do that. But if we've got a computational model of a physical system and we want to ask, what's it representing? Is it really representing? Then we need to complicate the picture a little bit. And I'm going to stick with the addition example. So in fact, there are going to be two mappings. There are going to be two mappings. The bottom mapping from the P's to the S's is going to specify what I'm calling the vehicles of representation. So the bottom mapping from the physical states, if it's a brain, these might be neural states, is going to be mapped to certain structures that are going to play the role in the model of vehicles. So what is it to be a vehicle of representation? Well, it's a physical thing with causal powers that has meaning or that carries meaning. And it's the top mapping from these structures to the abstract function that characterizes the meaning of the structures. So we've got a mapping of physical states to structures, to vehicles of representation, and I call that mapping the realization function. And then at the top, we've got a second mapping, which I call the interpretation function. And that specifies the meaning of these structures, the meaning of these representational vehicles. So that's what it is for a physical system. So on this account, then, these things, these vehicles represent addends and sums. So these two bottom arrows, they're both causal. The continuous arrow, this specifies causal relations between physical states. The arrow in the middle is also specifying a causal relation at a higher level of abstraction. So this, when we specify the vehicles, we're abstracting away from lots and lots of physical structure. So they're both of these arrows are causal. The top arrow, but the middle one is abstracted away from lots of neural detail that's not relevant to, might be relevant to maintaining a temperature the body, but it's not relevant to adding in this case. That the causal relations that are relevant to just that capacity are specified at the middle level. And then the top, again, as before, is just the top dashed arrow is just the specification of the arguments and values of the function. Okay, so on this account, then the structures or states at the middle carry meaning. S1s and S2s in this example mean 2 and 3, and the S3 means or has the content of 5. Okay, so again, there are two mappings. What I call a realization function, that's the bottom mapping. That shows how the physical states of the system realize the structures that count as vehicles that carry meaning. And the top mapping is the interpretation function, which specifies what those meanings are. In our example, they're going to be addends and sums. Okay, so I want to make a point about vehicles and before I go any further, and a point about contents. First, about vehicles, we should be liberal about what counts as a vehicle. They might be discrete symbols, but they could also be characteristic patterns of activation of a network. So representational vehicles are, what's important is that they're physically realized, they've got causal powers, they're kinds of things that do causal work. But beyond that, could be any kind of thing. The realization function, again, this is the bottom mapping, will abstract away from some properties of the realizing physical, or if it's brains, neural states, and group them together by their role in cognitive processing. So here, in our example, they'll be grouped together by their role that they play in allowing the system to add. A point about contents. The computational theory takes states of the system to literally represent the arguments and values of the computed function. So back to our, remember the diagram here, the states of the system characterized at the middle level, which are physical states, but that abstracts away from lots of their physical properties. Those literally represent the numbers that are the addends and sums. And I call these mathematical contents, and we should be straightforwardly realist about them. So here in this addition example, realism about both vehicles and contents is appropriate. Lots of examples in neuroscience, in computational neuroscience. Perceptual systems are often taken to compute smoothing functions. So for example, a theory of vision might hypothesize that a mechanism, a part of the early visual system computes a Laplacian of a Gaussian. And so that enables it to get rid of noise and detect edges. A theory of motor control might construe the system as taking in visual information and proprioceptive information and computing subtraction functions in enabling the organism or the larger system to grasp an object in view. Third example, again, there are countless examples. The ocular motor system is hypothesized to compute integration functions in enabling the system to keep track of eye positions during saccades. So again, lots and lots of examples, and I'm saying that these systems literally represent the arguments and values of the functions that they're taken to compute. They compute well-defined mathematical functions, and their input and output states represent the arguments and values of the function, as in the I'm generalizing from the addition example. Now, these mathematical contents, I'm saying we should be realistic about them, but that's not really what people have in mind when they argue about how to understand representational talk. They're not really talking about mathematical contents. What they're talking about is they're asking about whether there are structures in the head that represent things in the world. That's what the dispute's about. That's what the controversy is about. So theorists talk of the visual system representing edges in the world and of place cells in the rat brain representing locations in the local space. That's the kind of content or representation that's really at issue in the debate. They talk about internal states representing external distal objects and properties. Now, I call these contents cognitive contents as opposed to mathematical contents I was talking about a few minutes ago, because they're the sorts of contents that typically get attributed in models of cognitive capacities. So these contents, I mean, models of cognitive capacities do attribute mathematical contents, but they usually also, in addition, attribute cognitive contents, the sorts of contents that directly seem to give us an account of that depend on, well, we're interested in how's the visual system detecting edges out there. So the model will posit some structures that actually are taken to represent edge. That edge here is what I'm calling a cognitive content, not a mathematical content. So the question then is, how are cognitive contents determined? What gives them their content? Now, thinking back to the central examples of representations that we've all encountered and that we take for granted, they get them their contents by convention. You can look up, you want to know the content of a word, look it up in the dictionary, and that reflects, a good dictionary will reflect at any given time what the conventions are about what that word means. But that's not going to work for internal representations, for mental representations. So I'm turning now the title, I'm turning now to mental representations. How do they get their contents? It can't be by agreement among speakers or among subjects. It can't be by convention. It's got to be some other way. So how? And the general kind of proposal that's offered for how structures in the head, internal things, get to mean something about what's going on outside, the most popular proposals are called naturalistic proposals. So proponents of these accounts call their accounts naturalistic accounts. And I'm going to give you some examples of them. So naturalistic proposals, what distinguishes them, and again, these are proposals for cognitive contents, not what I'm calling mathematical contents. The idea is that the relation between an internal structure, so the S's, the middle level structures in my diagram, the relation between these things and what those things are about in the external world, we can call that the representation relation. It must be specifiable without reference to meanings or the interests of theorists. Why is that? Well, because it would be question begging if we explain how these things get their meanings, get their distal or external meanings, if we just refer to what theorists mean by them or what they intend to be saying when they use them. So a naturalistic proposal tries to specify this relation between what's in there and what's out there, their content, without referring to what theorists might have in mind, what their intentions are, what the meanings of their states of mind are. Now, there's an important motivation for naturalism. It's not that hard to understand. They aim to provide a foundational account of thought. So naturalistic proposals don't presuppose the representational capacities of agents. That's what they're supposed to explain. So they can't just take for granted the ability of scientists or theorists to represent. They're trying to explain that ability. And secondly, and kind of relatedly, computational theories aim to provide a mechanical account of thought. There's not supposed to be any mysterious processes involving meanings in such accounts. So that's ruled out. So naturalistic proposals then aim to satisfy these two constraints, explain meaning without presupposing meaning, and secondly, nothing spooky. Meanings are kind of spooky. Computational accounts are supposed to be mechanical. So the meanings that they attribute better kind of bottom out in processes that look natural or mechanical. Okay, so that's the motivation. The representation relation on these naturalistic accounts is assumed to be a kind of tracking relation. So the idea is that the internal state comes to have its external meaning in virtue of tracking or co-varying with what's going on outside. This state occurs in me only when there's an edge in the world. But that's the idea, that it tracks, the internal state gets its meaning by tracking or co-varying with its content in the world. So some examples will make this idea clear. So here's some examples of naturalistic accounts of meaning or content. There are causal-based accounts. And again, talking about cognitive contents, the sort of ordinary contents that we think about and that neuroscientists talk about. So in causal-based accounts, an internal structure means X, so maybe means edge. The structure in here means edge if it's caused by an edge out there. Just the representation relation on causal-based accounts is just a causal relation. An edge occurs in the world, and that causes me to have a structure that in my head that means edge. So on the first account, then the representation relation is just a causal relation. An alternative are teleological accounts. And on that view, those family of views, an internal structure means X, so means edge, if it has the biological function of indicating X's. So this means edge because basically me and creatures like me have evolved to detect edges. And so that's what gives this structure its meaning, edge, in me and my ancestors. So on teleological accounts, then the representation relation is spelled out in terms of evolutionary function. There's some variations on that. It's now a big family of views, but that's the key idea. A third possibility is structural similarity or homomorphism, and that's the type of relation that holds between a map and the objects and properties it represents. So the idea is basically there are maps in there, and they have the same structure as the structure of properties in the external world. So those are the most popular candidates for providing naturalistic accounts of how internal structures get to have the meanings that they do. Now there's a problem for all of these accounts, and that is that the problem is indeterminacy. Whatever the proposed tracking relation, covariation relation, it picks out too much. It fails to pick out a unique external condition. The internal structure seems to have multiple different meanings. So this tracking relation is just too unconstrained. The indeterminacy problem, I think, can be spelled out most naturally or most intuitively by reference to Jerome Letvin's famous frog and his collaborators' famous frog and fly example. So they asked, what is the frog's eye telling the frog's brain? And that's our question. What's going on here? What's it telling the frog about what's out there? But what exactly? Trying to hone in on what exactly is the content of the structure in the head that causes the frog's tongue to lash out and catch the fly. So probably, I mean, this is familiar. A fly crosses the frog's visual field, and that automatically triggers the tongue, comes out and catches it when things, typically when things go well. So what's it telling? What's the content of the internal structure that causes that mechanism? And sorry. Okay, so here's some popular candidates. The internal structure in the frog means fly, because it's flies that typically engage it. In the frog's normal environment, it's usually flies that it catches that makes the tongue lash out. So it means fly. An alternative, and all of these are actually been proposed by teleological semanticists. An alternative is food. The structure in the frog's head means food because that's what it needs. That's why it's doing that, to get nutritious stuff inside it. Or alternatively, a different content, small dark moving object. Why that? Well, because that's what normally engages the mechanism. So if you lobbed a food pellet across the frog's visual field, that would engage the mechanism too. So any small dark moving object triggers it. Doesn't have to be food. So those are rationales for preferring one of these contents over the others. Now here's an objection, maybe a natural objection. So what? So I've said the indeterminacy problem is too many contents. So the objection is, who cares? Why can't we have, let 1,000 flowers bloom? Let's have lots of contents. What's wrong with that? Doesn't the internal structure represent all of these things? Fly, food, small dark moving thing, and maybe lots of other things. And the reply is that it matters because if the structure doesn't have determinate content and then determinate correctness conditions, then it isn't a representation. Remember, that was one of the constraints at the beginning that we put on something being a representation. All the examples of representation that we can think of, they have the ability to get it right or get it wrong. And that better be the case for these internal representations if they're literally to count as representations and we're not just kind of using language loosely. So it matters because the structure has to have a determinate content. It can't mean maybe this in one case, this something else in another case, something else in another case. Imagine a map, when you use it on a Monday, it represents certain things, and then when we use it on a Tuesday, it represents different things. That would be useless as a representation. So again, recall that a characteristic feature of representations is that they can misrepresent. But if the structure doesn't have determinate content and hence determinate correctness conditions, then it's impossible to draw a line between a correct application and an error. So back to our candidates for content, each one draws the line in a different place. If the internal structure means fly, then that means that when the frog catches a food pellet, it misrepresents the food pellet as a fly. On the other hand, if it means small dark moving object, then it gets it right because a food pellet, just like a fly, is a small dark moving object. So each of these candidates carves things up differently. It draws the distinction between getting the system getting it right and getting it wrong in different places. Nonetheless, though, so that's the problem. But nonetheless, I think there's something right about the objection that, why doesn't it have all of these contents? Why do we have to choose? I think there's something right about that. And it's this: any of these contents might plausibly be attributed, just not all at once. You can imagine different theorists kind of arguing for their favorite content, and they might come up with plausible arguments for why it should be fly rather than small dark moving thing. So how would we decide between those proposals? And here's my idea. We get determinate content only by appealing to the theorist's explanatory aims and goals. The justification for selecting one content over the others is pragmatic. So let's go back to the candidates for content. If the theorist's goal is to explain the role of the frog in its larger environmental niche, then the theorist might go for fly. Alternatively, the theorist might be more interested in explaining how the frog is able to survive and reproduce. Give an account of its well-being, in which case food would be a more plausible content candidate because that's what the system really needs. A third case, imagine that it's a visual scientist, a visual theorist, and the task is to explain how the visual mechanism works. Then whether it's fly or a food pellet isn't really relevant to that project. And such a theorist is likely going to say, well, it's a small dark moving thing because that's what engages the mechanism. Whether it's a fly food, or a BB that's completely unnutritious that's lobbed at the fly in a laboratory. So the point is then different explanatory projects are going to motivate different content attributions. General point is that indeterminacy of content is resolved only by reference to specific explanatory interests, that is, to theorist goals and intentions, most plausibly collective goals and intentions of scientific communities. And once we have determinate content, then we have a way of partitioning the system's responses into correct applications on the one hand, and mistakes or misrepresentations on the other. But we get determinate contents only as a result of pragmatic choices by theorists. That's how we get this way of partitioning the space. So here's another objection: whether the brain genuinely represents or not, whether it's doing something enough like our central cases of representation to count genuinely as representation, that's presumably an objective matter, not something to be determined by reference to the goals and pragmatic choices of theorists. Here's my reply. Despite theorists' representational talk, computational theories do not posit representations with determinate cognitive content. What they posit are structures that play specific causal roles in cognitive processes. It is a purely objective matter whether there are such structures and whether they behave in the way the theory specifies. That's what's objective. Not the attribution of content, which I'm arguing is determined by the pragmatic choices of theorists. So some of these structures are assigned content in what I call an explanatory gloss. In particular, a representational gloss that accompanies the theory. This content, and so the pragmatic elements that determine this content, is not in the theory, but rather is quarantined in the representational gloss. Now, this may be kind of in these COVID times, an unfortunate choice of words here with quarantine, but I think it's not entirely inappropriate. What's crucial here is the idea of isolating. The content is, and the cognitive content, and the pragmatic choices that determine it are isolated from what I'm calling, from the theory proper, from what's actually doing the explanatory work. And they're isolated in what I'm calling a representational gloss. A representational gloss is a particular kind of explanatory gloss. So I'm appealing to a distinction between what we might call the computational theory proper and an explanatory gloss that accompanies it. Determinate cognitive content, a necessary condition for a structure to count as a representation, is in the explanatory gloss. So I've got this distinction going between the theory proper and the explanatory gloss. So let me specify exactly what's in the theory proper and what's then left for the gloss. The theory proper specifies the mathematical functions computed by the mechanism. So again, maybe smoothing functions, integration functions, vector subtraction, so on, as in the examples that I've talked about. The algorithms, secondly, the algorithms involved in the computation of the functions, the structures that the algorithm maintains, the computational processes defined over these structures, and in a fully articulated model, the structures and processes, how they're realized in the brain will be specified. And then finally, and importantly, what I call the ecological component. And these are general facts about the organism's normal environment that explain why computing the specified mathematical functions, that is what's the function specified in 1, why computing that function, mathematical function in context, that is in the organism's normal environment, is sufficient for the successful exercise of the cognitive capacity to be explained. So these facts might include such things as light typically comes from above, objects are typically rigid in translation. That plays a key role in Shimon Ullman's account of how the visual system is able to get motion, structure information from motion. So the point is that this will specify facts about the subject's normal environment that motivate or justify the mathematical function specified in 1, because mathematical functions are completely general. But in context, computing that function, maybe computing a particular smoothing function, enables the system to detect edges in the environment. So that exhausts. So let me just say a little bit more about this, relating it to David Marr's account of different parts of theory or levels of theory. His top level, computational level, is made up of 1 and 5 together. That explains what the system does, that specifies what the system does and why it's useful. And 2 through 4 are specifying the how it's computing the function that enables the organism to add or detect edges or whatever. So let's focus on the 3rd and 4th elements of what I'm calling the theory proper. So let me go back for a minute. So that exhausts the theory proper. No cognitive contents there. No reference to these structures that are specified at 3 representing edges in the world or representing anything out there. That's in what I'm calling the explanatory gloss. So the structures that the algorithms maintain, that's 3 and 4, and the computational processes defined over these structures are glossed as representations. They're assigned, meaning they're assigned content in what I'm calling the representational gloss. And the causal process is specified by 4. The computational processes are just causal processes. They're glossed as representational processes. So there are lots of explanatory glosses in science. The notion should not be new or strange. Niels Bohr glossed the atom as a planetary system. Maxwell glossed electromagnetic phenomena, in particular Faraday's lines of force, as the movement of fluid through tubes. These explanatory glosses play various heuristic and pedagogical roles. They serve these sorts of functions in various theories. So you find that all over science, not just in computational neuroscience. A representational gloss is a particular kind of explanatory gloss, and it construes internal structures as representing external objects and properties. So for example, a structure that's posited and it's real, you know, the structures are real, and that's in the theory, but it might be interpreted in the gloss as representing an edge. So why do we need this gloss? Why do we need, what's the point of a representational gloss? Doesn't the theory do it all? What I'm calling the theory proper, isn't 1 through 5 sufficient to explain how the system is able to detect edges or reach for grasp objects and so on? Well, strictly speaking, yes. 1 through 5 is sufficient to explain what the system's doing and how it's able to be successful in the cognitive capacity that the theory's taken on. But there's still some work, some pedagogical and heuristic work to be done by the representational gloss. So I'm going to talk how am I doing for time?
You started a few minutes late, so maybe at 10:02.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. I think that I should be able to do that. So I'm going to isolate 3 jobs or functions of a representational gloss that they do over and above what the theory proper is able to achieve. So one important one is a cognitive theory aims to explain a capacity, a competence. Now that's not, so the capacity to add, to detect edges, to grasp objects and so on. Those are normative characterizations of things. It's not just a bunch of behaviors. Success is built into the characterization of the target of theorizing. So that's not a normatively neutral way of characterizing a class of behaviors. It presumes that the behavior is typically, not always, but typically correct or successful. So a representational gloss of the posited mechanisms allows us to see a specific instance of behavior as correct or as a mistake, as accurately representing or misrepresenting its target, which might be an edge in the scene, for example. So one function of a representational gloss is to connect the theory proper with its normatively characterized explanatory project. So remember back at, I said that Computational theories aim to give purely mechanical accounts of cognitive capacities. There's no notion of correct or mistake or getting it wrong or getting it right. Those are normative ways of characterizing some of the behaviors of the system. It's not in the theory proper. It's rather in the gloss that accompanies it. So one function then is we tend to think at the beginning of theorizing. You know, you write a grant for it to try to provide an account of how we're able to see edges, what our competence, a cognitive capacity or competence. That's what you're supposed to be explaining, and then you can get these notions of mistake or getting it right, these normatively loaded motions back in to connect it with the project that you got the grant money for. The theory proper doesn't traffic in those normative notions. Here's a second function of representational gloss. It characterizes internal structures in a way that makes clear their causal role in a process that typically extends into the environment. The content attribution selects what's important in a complex causal process. So think about the frog and the fly again. There's lots of things going on between the fly going across its visual field and the tongue lashing out. Part of what's involved is that there's proximal stimulations on the retina. The causal process is incredibly complicated, but not all of that is relevant. Certainly not all of what's going on in any individual case. You don't want a long disjunction of the retinal stimulations. So the representational content selects what's important, explanatorily important in a complex causal process. Content attribution then involves a pragmatic-based selection over the entire causal process. It's abstracting away from a lot of irrelevant detail that's definitely part of the causes, but not relevant to what we want to, how we want to understand the system. So I can give you a more, maybe more realistic example really quickly. Place cells in the rat hippocampus. Their discovery was crucial to characterizing the mechanism underlying spatial navigation in rats. Place cells respond to particular regions of the local environment. Okay, that's all part of the science, that's part of the theory proper. But neuroscientists gloss this process using representational talk. So place cells respond to particular places in the local environment, and the scientist talks about their firing representing those places in the environment. Harmless talk. It's not really carrying any theoretical load. Head direction cells respond to head direction and also said to represent head direction. Nothing is really added beyond specifying what the stimulus conditions are for these cells, and then what happens causally downstream. Nothing really crucial is added by saying this represents this. What's important is specifying the conditions to which the cell's firing is responsive and determining its role in controlling subsequent behavior. Talk of the cell's firing representing its distal stimulus conditions is a convenience that adds nothing of theoretical significance. The primary function of content description here is characterizing internal structures in a way that makes clear their causal role in a cognitive process, and making clear their causative role, their causal role in a cognitive process will involve generalizing over the particular proximal stimulations, abstracting away from all of that detail, and glomming onto what's crucial for understanding what the system's doing. A third function, the attribution of cognitive contents can also serve as a placeholder for an incompletely developed computational theory prior to the specification of the structures and processes that make up the theory proper, what I'm calling the theory proper, and guide the search for mechanisms underlying the capacity. So in other words, before the theorist has gotten a handle on the elements of the theory proper, on what the structures are, what the algorithms are, what the causal processes are, she might, in order to keep kind of her eye on the explanatory target, a normatively characterized competence or capacity, she might at an early stage ascribe content. She might say that there's cells in the primary visual cortex that's detecting edges. They represent edges. Loose talk at this point, but it serves a purpose. So at this early stage of theory development, so at this point, there's really no theory yet. So there's no theory to gloss. So it's not a gloss, this isn't a gloss function, but it's still an important function. At this early stage of theory development, fictionalism may be an appropriate attitude to take towards representational talk. That's very early in the process. But fictionalism about representational talk isn't generally correct. A fully articulated theory posits structures that play specified causal roles in cognitive processes. These structures really exist. Place cells really exist. If they're assigned cognitive content in a representational gloss, then they're glossed as representations, but they're not fictions. So here's finally what I mean by deflationary account or deflationism. The structures that are posited by the theory proper that are involved in causal processes, those really exist. They're assigned content in a gloss that serves various heuristic purposes that I've outlined. It's appropriate to call the structures that are assigned content in the gloss representational vehicles or simply representations, because in the gloss they carry meaning or content. So I'm almost done. Let me just quickly summarize the key points. Contents play complex heuristic roles in computational theories of cognitive capacities, but they're for the benefit of theorists and students of cognition. They make intelligible the account of the mechanisms specified by the theory. Attributing determinate contents in the gloss, that's the only place where you get determinate cognitive content, that allows us to see the organism's activity as accurate representation of the world and occasionally as misrepresentation. Normative notions such as correctness and mistake are confined to the representational gloss. They're not in what I'm calling the theory proper. The gloss gives us what we might think of as kind of a rational overlay on the mathematical and mechanical processes characterized by the theory, an overlay that makes contact with our common sense conception of ourselves. So one way to see the gloss is that it puts a human face on the mathematical and mechanical processes that are specified by what I'm calling the theory proper. Thanks.
I think maybe for questions, you could just say it loudly and maybe we could ask Francis to just repeat the essence of the question.
This was fascinating. So there is there's a saying in there's a famous quote in statistics. It says all models are wrong, but some are useful. So the perplexing thing is the term model there. So we have in computational models, we have models which represent the data, and we have models which try to represent, I have to be careful when I use the word represent the brain, to say what the brain does. The other one says what the data says about the brain. So when you talk about content and you say whether or not these are realistic, do they have realistic value? Would you put them in the same category? As an example, your Bayesian colleague who would do that analysis, they say, okay, there might be a Gaussian noise there. They would do it because it just works on the data. But another person may look at the same problem, may say, oh, we need this Gaussian noise because the brain does that. These are two different claims. So in that sense, would you put different values on, is there realistic value in these two models or not? They are the same category.
Yeah, I would separate them. So what I say to my colleague, James Felton, is it's really interesting. You've done important work. You're systematizing data. You're systematizing what the brain is doing under certain circumstances, and that's really important. But and he thinks that's once he gets a systematization of the data, he thinks his job is done. And I would say your job's just begun. You've got a lot of data that can help you to characterize what the brain is actually doing. How is it actually detecting edges? And so that's the notion of model that I should say. There are lots of different notions of model. The term gets a million. But to kind of rely on your distinction, that's the notion of model that I'm working with here. I'm interested in explanatory models, or at least by that I mean models that purport to explain what the brain is actually doing in achieving this cognitive capacity. Now, you started out by saying all models are wrong. Okay, that's perfectly compatible with what I'm saying. There are lots of mistakes we're trying to get to the right model, and there are going to be lots and lots of wrong, incorrect models on the way to get. Thanks.
No, I changed my mind. I'll deliver the microphone. Oh, okay.
So, I figure out how to say this. We're always, so in the talk you talked about like, there's sort of like your internal computation and then there's an environment, and it's kind of like a back and forth procedure. And so what I was wondering, can you explain instances where we kind of use the environment to perform a computation, like counting on your fingers or something like that, where it's like there's not a single computation happening at my end or on the environment's end, but it's kind of like a closed loop. Does that make sense?
Any real important distinction here? There's kind of the environment is always going to play a role in an explanation of cognitive, at least of cognitive capacities that involve our interacting with the environment in some way. And that was what I was trying to isolate in the fifth element of the theory proper, in what I call the ecological component. So in that simple sort of case, you've got, so some of these might be kind of loops. Some of these computations, they're dynamic, they're all dynamical processes. They involve interaction. You're doing something in the environment, and then your visual system or your proprioceptive system is getting information from what you've done. And so there's a really complicated feedback loops. But I don't think that introduces complexity. But the processes are going to be complex anyway, because they're taking place over time, dynamical processes. But I don't think it introduces any important difference.
Someone else?
Thanks.
I feel like a talk show host.
So you talked about the representational gloss as, at least in my interpretation, helping us understand how humans interpret these things, how we can ascribe normative claims, and how theorists can use it to help specify hypotheses and whatnot. Isn't that essentially what's going on in most of your central examples, like writing and utterances, in the sense that it's always human interpretability coming into the picture? And if that's sort of our general understanding of what representation is in those central examples, is it that much of a stretch to say that's the same as representation in this case?
Examples that I started with, those are all public representations, and their meanings depend on agreement among the users of those representations. So they depend on conventions. And having conventions depends on ways to communicate with other people about it, so that we can come to an agreement about what the sound cat means, for example. That's presupposing all of the work that computational neuroscience are, that's presupposing the explanatory burden that they're taking on in explaining what's involved in seeing the letters cat or hearing that sound in a particular way. So the public examples, they all presuppose the interesting representational questions that the neuroscientists are taking on the explanatory burden to figure out. So that's the sense in which, when I said that these computational models aim to be foundational, they may be, and we can think of it as they start with a kind of a common sense characterization of how are you able to get around in the environment? How are you able to see the three-dimensional structure of the environment? If they start with the characterization of something as a competence or as meaning or as representation, the theory has to actually kind of discharge those commitments to meaning. It can't depend on them, or it hasn't provided a foundational account, it's taken for granted what it's trying to explain. So that's the difference between the examples that I started with and the examples that I'm trying to elucidate in the computational practice.
Let's thank Professor Egan again. Thank you.